Thank you so much. And first, I just want to say how fantastic it is to be here and to welcome Rachel, my sister twin from Memphis,
Yes.
to Cincinnati. And I am just encouraged by the number of people in this room. We recently hosted a brilliant professor from Southern California called Manuel Pastor. He is a professor of sociology and ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and he talks about the need to have conversations about race and racial equity as an important way to build that muscle of comfort. It's almost like working out. If you work out once a month, it's going to be very challenging and painful, but the more you work out, the easier it is to have those conversations. And so racial equity is not something that will probably be solved in our generation, but the more conversations we have, the less awkward it gets, and the more we are building that muscle. So I'm encouraged by the fact that you're all here and that we're having this conversation, and that's a very good thing. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I've really enjoyed my time in Cincinnati so far. It feels a lot like home. Everyone has just been so welcoming and kind, and the city is amazing, and you all are doing incredible work, as we've heard here today. So I just wanted to read a quote that kind of helps set the context of the conversation we're having. So in the March on Washington, Dr. King said this. He said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. It is this unfolding conundrum of life and history. There is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action." So this was in 1963. We're in 2019, where we have, and I hate this term, but majority-minority states like Texas and California. Yesterday, we had a really robust conversation about how in 2045, a majority of the United States will be made up of people of color. So I guess the first question I have for you is, at what point do we get started on this racial equity work for these Black and brown people who are, continuously becoming a majority of our population, but are still unable to access the same resources as their white counterparts?
Wow, if I could answer that and solve it, drop the mic, right? But it's a really important statistic, because I think it creates what we are calling a very fierce sense of urgency, that this is an experience that the Black community is having here is not positive, and across the country. We know that there's systems in place that are intentionally holding us back. And so when we think about a country that's majority-minority, is that the trajectory we want for our future and for our children and our families? Absolutely not. And so we're really talking about it in terms of now being the time that we all need to put all hands on deck. Today, most babies born are babies of color, and literally by next spring, the majority of people that are 18 and younger will be of color, majority. So it's happening, we're in the throes of it. The Greater Cincinnati Foundation, where I work, we are looking at it as an opportunity to really take responsibility for this. And kind of rally the community around this sense of urgency. But the challenge we have is really, how do you create that sense of urgency for those who are least affected by this issue? We're preaching to the choir, we're having conversations in rooms like this, and most of you are aware of this issue and are working tirelessly. So we're really focused on bringing that conversations to rooms that are not typically having this conversation, and to those who are least affected, because it's gonna really take collective action to move this and to be able to get to where we are. Yeah.
Yes, and so in Memphis, it's very interesting working in the philanthropic sector, because we have about 6 foundations, and we also have a community foundation, but it's not necessarily as guided as I think some of the work that you're doing right now, and really helping people to invest in work that will ultimately help the city of Memphis, which, by the way, our demographics, we're 65% Black, we're about 5% other populations of color, so 70% of our city is made up of people of color, but we don't see Black people in positions of power. In our nonprofit sector, where we fund, only about 14% of the executive directors of those organizations are Black or a person of color. So we have some glaring inequities, and that's very problematic for a city like Memphis, where, as you know, Dr. King was assassinated really before he began his Poor People's Campaign, which is, of course, socioeconomic equity that is directly tied to racial equity. I think one of the things that has become very clear to me in my time in philanthropy is that we're really an unregulated group of people with a lot of resources, right? So we can give money to whoever we want, whether that will help the city, whether that will hurt the city, whether that helps or hurts populations of color. And so it is really up to us to make sure that we are doing the work as Black and brown people in philanthropy to make sure that we are making the change that we want to see. Yeah. And I know that you're doing that work right now with kind of educating families at the foundation.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think it's going to be critical that we rethink the way we're doing business. It's going to require disruption because we're doing the same thing and expecting different results. So you're right, philanthropy, fairly unregulated, a tremendous amount of resources are going into grants in this community. I would say upwards of 150 million per year. And yet the disparities are getting worse. Mm-hmm. And so we are very comfortable as a foundation completely reinventing what a funder looks like, because we feel like the opportunity we have is we can leverage the deep relationships we have. We have some level of influence and we know the community. And so to be able to say, it's more than just cutting a check, it's about how we catalyze and influence and inspire and raise awareness and tell stories to bring people to the table. It's going to require sort of building different kinds of tools and adding tools to our toolkit in order to be effective. So we really need to think our business model, because it's not acceptable. Mm-hmm. And it's a shameful statistic for us to be in this community most generous. By the way, we're top 10 generous, and yet we have some of the worst poverty rates, especially among African American. So we have this really weird dichotomy of tale of two cities going on, where we have the best but yet the worst, and we feel that we want to bridge that gap. So it's going to require a lot of that in order for us to meet this impending deadline that's upon us.
Yeah.
And I think it's similar in Memphis.
It is. Actually, we tend to be, I think we're at the top of that list usually of most generous cities in America, but we have the exact same issue. Exceptionally high poverty, 29%. Child poverty rate is one of the highest in the country at 36%. We have some very real and tangible problems that we have to face and work on. And we can't do it alone, and we know that government can't do it alone, and so we have to get all the stakeholders at the table to be able to do this work. Speaking personally, because I actually work for a family, I work at a family foundation, so I just have the one family to answer to, not multiple families to try and get together.
Community.
And I will say that at the Haile Foundation, we are very much about what you kind of refer to as, what we refer to as sleeves rolled up philanthropy. Like, yes, we will write a check, but we also want to connect you with other resources, whether that's capacity building work, whether it's communications plans, whether it's other people that can help you get your small business off the ground. And so for us, we are really focused on not only bringing equity to our grant making practice of like funding more Black-led organizations and pushing for organizations to bring more Black and brown people on their boards and on their staffs, but also really focusing on the fact that we just need to get more people to understand that in a city that's majority Black, like, you cannot expect the city to thrive if you're not investing directly into those populations.
Yeah. And it's interesting, when we started our racial equity journey, we really started it as an equity journey. And we were sort of trying to wrestle with, what does this mean, and how do we become impactful? What does this mean for us as an organization? And the more we dug into it, the more we realized it is specifically racial equity. We have to put a sharper point on the word race. We know this community is not comfortable talking about race. I just spoke about how not talking about it is really a challenge, because then you can't address what you don't talk about. And so we are really using words like institutional racism and systemic racism, and they are uncomfortable words, but it's really critical that in order to solve it, we call it out. Mm-hmm. And so one thing I want to tell you is that, and I think you know this, is that this is really hard, right? So these are issues that took generations to come about, so we're not necessarily going to see results right away. Do you have any tips and tricks for institutions or those who want to take this on, and how do you sort of address that?
Sure. So in my work, specifically with not only arts and culture, but also leadership organizations, we kind of have a two-prong approach. So the first was to fund Black organizations. When I got at the foundation, first arrived, 15% of my portfolio was led by people of color. By the end of this year, it will be 40%, with 38% of that funding going towards those organizations. And that's something we're really proud of, but the work isn't done. We want to make sure that our portfolios are representative for the city of Memphis. So eventually, we would like to, by the end of our strategic plan, get to a portfolio that's 65% led by people of color. And that is a lot of hard work, and it is a very heavy lift. But more than that, more than just bringing people to the table and talking about just equity, like we're really pivoting to like parity, right? So not only making sure that we're funding Black and white organizations at the same level, but making sure that we're also advocating for Black and brown organizations. That if a Black theater is outperforming their white counterpart, that we're requesting and saying, I'm uncomfortable giving them the same amount of money and telling them that they are doing just as good a job as their white counterpart when they are doing twice, 3 times, 4 times as much. And so I would say that advocacy is one of our first kind of levers, but then the second one is this term that I've used called carrot stick. So there's this idea, of course, that you can either induce people with a carrot or a stick, right? And so we have kind of found this middle ground where organizations that are hyper white in their staff and in their boards, that we find a way to work with them to diversify over time. So we have this one theater, it's one of our larger, and I won't say its name to protect the guilty. Their staff they have a staff of about 40 people. It is 98% white. Their board, which is about 30 people, was also like 97% white. And we were like, this is unacceptable. So they get an annual grant from us that's unrestricted. It's $50,000. And I said, listen, we're gonna give you $40,000 and we're gonna hold the other $10,000 until you send me a plan for how you're gonna diversify your board. And that was, they were very shocked. They called my boss and they were like, I don't know who you hired, but this girl just told me that she's holding my money until we put more Black people on the board. And they're like, yes. And then he called me back and he was like, okay, what do I need to do? So it does require a lot of bravery in those moments too, and people who have your back as well. Yes. But I said, you all know how many people are going to be rolling off your board in the next 3 years. I want to see a plan that's a stretch goal for you, but I'm not going to be prescriptive in how you change the demographics of your board. But I also know if you're BSing me, so keep that in mind. So we held the $10,000. I checked on them at halfway through the year. They have a plan. They have about 9 people rolling off over the next 2 years. They are saving for each year. It's about, so it's 9 people over 3 years. They have 3 people rolling off every year. They're saving 2 spots for people of color. They're gonna engage in a DEI plan for their organization. And I was like, well, here's your $10,000. Good job. And so, but I think also it was that we were fully ready to not fund them, not only the $10,000, but not fund them in the future. So that was the stick. So the carrot was you get the rest of your grant. The stick was if you don't do this, we're not going to fund you. And I think sometimes philanthropy really has to take a hard stance on these issues that we know are going to affect the quality and just the overall magic of our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a great example of building some small wins and one at a time being able to influence some level of change, because I think we know this is really hard work. And we've been kind of studying like what is happening in places where there's major movements or major change that happens. And they're often grounded in a shared vision with great data and something inspiring that gets people to say, oh, we all need to collectively do this. Because ultimately, everybody wins when you have equity, and no one has to lose. And so there are great examples of that in history. For instance, the curb cut effect is something that you may have heard of, is that every sidewalk has curb cuts, and initially that was designed for people that were disabled, so their wheelchairs could get through, and yet who benefits from curb cuts? All of us with our wheelchairs, but luggage and strollers and joggers and et cetera, people on bikes. So everybody wins, and so we're talking more about that. And I think the idea of a shared vision is something that we're also feeling like if we are going to create that fierce sense of urgency in this community, what is it going to take? So that's sort of our next big rock is how do we get everyone to see this affects me and I have to do something about it so that we can get to that collective action. So we're talking about that building of community will, and we're going to really try to look at how do we create something inspiring that people can all rally around and cast a vision for this community that everybody wants to be a part of. So we know we can be an unstoppable region if we are able to unlock the potential of this community. And all the promises that are made to us that are here, promise of life, happiness, and liberty are fulfilled. And so what does that take? And so we'll be doing a little bit more of that in terms of the vision casting.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Hyde Foundation has always kind of been a leader in our philanthropic sector. We have always kind of been the first ones in. So the Lorraine Motel, after Dr. King's assassination, was about to be torn down because it was a nuisance and it was just filled with, prostitution, drugs, et cetera. And the foundation was the first donor and said, let's save it. Let's make it a museum, and now it's the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel, and they continue to do excellent work, showing people who are still in the fight for human and civil rights all across the world, not just in the United States. We really understand that civic responsibility is not just for foundations. It's not just for people who have large checkbooks. It's for anyone. Anyone can be a philanthropist. Anyone can help change the world. And I think that places like Cincinnati and places like Memphis, it is electric. You can feel it in the air of people who want to help, people who are doing the work and have done the work even without resources. And it's really exciting when philanthropy gets to come alongside those people and just kind of supercharge their work with the funding that they need. But it only works if we're really focused on the communities that have been undercapitalized for so long and really making that change, because if the people who are affected aren't at the table and aren't a part of the decision making, then we're still missing the mark.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what is it going to take? I think that's where we are. I think ultimately building the language that makes it relatable is important. And so it's expensive to have inequities. It's unhealthy. It's stressful.
Yep.
And we are feeling like perhaps the corporate sector and other non-traditional audiences can benefit from this message. But for those of us in the room that may feel like, how do we start? What does it involve? We're really talking about the fact that it's wherever you are is the right place to be. Just start, because you're never going to get to that point where you can say, we are ready to take on racial equity. It's you've heard the numbers, the data is there, it's clear, it's happening, it's inevitable, and so just jump in. It's not going to be perfect. Talking about it builds the muscle and makes us better, and that's how the collective will be built.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, to grant people grace and grant yourself grace, because when sometimes you're not fully ready and but you're approaching it with the best intentions you can and the resources you have, like, it's not always going to work, and there has to be space to learn from our mistakes and to grant ourselves grace and for people to lovingly chastise us when we mess up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
Are we actually done on time?
Are we? What's happening?
We are setting the model.
Yes.
Well, maybe I'll close by saying this in terms of model, is that's the dream that we have, is that Cincinnati can sort of pave the way for the country as to what a model of racial equity looks like and pioneering that. And so we are well ready for that challenge. We hope that we can partner some more, and it's been a delight working with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
y'all.